So I'm Robert Nichols, based at the University of East Anglia in the Tyndall Centre, and I think Suraj has very well set out the problem we were trying to tackle in OpenClim. Really, we've got the foundation of 3 climate change risk assessments and national adaptation plans, and thinking how can we move forward in terms of bringing in different models, being consistent with the models and joining them up, and thinking through things like adaptation, really. How can we, if we identify a risk, to what extent can we respond to that risk? And it's been touched on with the CCC report today. So OpenClim is a consortium of universities and research organizations. So UEA and Newcastle are sort of the main partners in OpenClim, and we're both members of the Tyndall Centre, so that's the Tyndall Centre part, but we brought in other partners as well. University of Bristol, they were looking at the issue of heat. The UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, looking at agriculture. Daphne and the Science and Technology Facilities Council, they were dealing with legacy and how we, and the workflows, structure, etc. And then Paul Sayers and partners looking at flooding. So that's the OpenClim consortium. And if we look at our goal, it was really, how can we, an assessment method is kind of quite clear in the call. It was an assessment method for CCRA 4 and beyond. I mean, I think this is a process. So it's not, CCRA 4 is not the end, there'll be CCRA 5, etc. So it's ongoing, it's something we want to be able to build and to grow and to enhance our capacity as a nation to look at climate risks and adaptation choices. So that's the overall goal. The vision then really is about sort of integrated assessment and bringing together risk and adaptation models from multiple sectors and in an open framework. So we're trying to build something here that is drawing as much as possible on what exists. We're improving on it, linking it together, and making it as open as we can. And really informing the science and policy development, really, obviously with informing CCRA 4. And then the innovation really is consistent and spatially explicit results. So we want to be producing maps, and I think also considering adaptation. And it's not written down there, but I think because we're fundamentally working with sort of process and physics-based sort of models, they can be reconfigured to answer new questions as well. So they're flexible and adaptable, so they can evolve to the science policy environment and the questions change. And when I talk, OpenClim is a project. It ends at the end of August 2023. But it's also a vision as well of something bigger. And clearly, without the vision, the OpenClim project doesn't make much sense because we're thinking about something that goes on beyond the life of this August 2023 funding. So to give you a structure, so the framework. So we sort of started with this picture and we've kept it throughout. So it sort of stood the test of time over 3 years and the COVID pandemic. Because I mean, I must say, some members of the team, we've only met very recently in person. We've had a lot of meetings on Teams, and Zoom a little bit, but more on Teams. But we have gone through that COVID time. And the first thing is obviously climate scenarios. And again, we're sort of agnostic to climate, but we are using UK CP18, but other climate scenarios could be used there. And then socioeconomic scenarios. So the UK SSPs again, but again, you could bring in other views of the socioeconomic future. Then the climate scenarios move on. That leads to changes to hazard, and socioeconomic scenarios lead to changes to vulnerability and exposure. And that feeds on down into risk assessment. And we have a suite of models that you'll be hearing about that look at the different sort of risks as there. And then lastly, and this is ongoing, some synthesis, natural capital in the economy. So this is work in progress that we won't be talking about today. And then adaptation. I think we want to stress adaptation because we recognize that adaptation can happen at multiple scales. It can happen in all kinds of ways. And one would think that when we look at the future, we'll probably end up doing portfolios of adaptation. It's unlikely we'll do one thing and that will solve all the problems. And Because of those different scales, we recognize we can look at adaptation at the scale of maybe the risk assessment, an individual house, or we can look at changes in the catchment, for example, if we're talking about flooding. So, and then we think the models in OpenClim can handle all those different scales, so we can examine adaptation portfolios. This is illustrating the different themes that we looked at. This is not a CCRA4. I mean, we're illustrating the process. We're not doing a national risk assessment. And we covered sort of 6 themes here. Urban development, which is fundamentally taking the socioeconomic scenarios and turning them into, looking at the vulnerability and exposure into sort of exposure units then we also looked at agriculture, biodiversity, flooding in different forms, heat stress, and drought and water supply. And then in green, I won't read it out, but you can see the different models that we're using in the project. We did a lot of work with stakeholders. Despite COVID, we had lots of online meetings, and we consulted with what would stakeholders really want. And so this is specified from that process, that they wanted warming levels of 2 and 4 degrees, a strong focus on SSP2 and SSP4, but others if they're available, and time steps up to 2080. So that's how you'll see the information presented today structured. And lastly, legacy is really important. And I think many of the people working in OpenClim have been involved in projects in the past that looked at integrated assessment. And when we were writing the OpenClim proposal, we reflected on the legacy of those projects, which is we always learn things, but sometimes the software is not as available after the project ends as it might be. So Daphne provides a legacy in terms of, well, it provides a structure in terms of the workflow structure, so operationally how we build what we're doing in OpenClim, but it also provides a legacy for the data and the models. Daphne will last beyond OpenClim. And the geographic coverage, well, it's specified by the terms of reference. It's a national assessment. So we're talking about the United Kingdom. And also, of course, the devolved administrations, so who deal with the issue of adaptation. But I think it's very exciting when you start to think about providing detailed spatial results, that you can start to think about, well, what if we have libraries of all these results, how can they be used in new and exciting ways? And so we've also looked at the subnational, and we started off with the Clyde and Norfolk as places we didn't do anything more there, but we did scrutinize the results more closely, and we discussed them with stakeholders. And that's grown, and we're actually working now, we're looking at the Highland Council, where we're actually involved with an active risk assessment, and Northern Ireland, where we're looking at Northern Ireland as a whole. So this just illustrates that when you start to have these large libraries of results, the different types of things that might be possible. And we want to sort of develop that further, for sure. Outputs, again, quite a lot of information on this slide. If you look, I suppose it gives you the scales at which we're working. The coarser scale is 12 kilometers in the heat work. The urban flooding is actually working at 2 meters. That's the model resolution. We're outputting those results at 1 kilometer, so we're not actually presenting the full results in terms of spatial detail, because we don't, issues of blight, etc., and accuracy. And so that sort of summarizes the information. We have UK coverage in most cases, but in some cases it's not been possible to have UK coverage. And then the others are really addressing the stakeholder requirements. One thing we did, I think, again, it's a result, but it's sort of not really a model result, but it's a very important result, is an adaptation inventory. So we actually have created an online database using particularly the adaptation power reports as the main source of information, which has identified 360 examples of on-the-ground adaptation in the UK. And that's been written up, and that's fully available for anybody that's interested in adaptation. So thinking about next steps and the legacy of OpenClim before we move on to the results. Well, the project ends in August 2023. I think I've already said that. And so over the coming months, what are we going to be doing? We're going to be completing our results database. We're going to be doing a lot of work on data visualization. So we've got data, but I think we recognize that it's really important that you're able to see it, and that's going to really increase the value of what we've done. We're also planning to train stakeholders to assess the models and results, and that will be discussed. That'll be available to book in the World Cafe after lunch, and obviously producing reports and papers. But I made the point about OpenClim being, the vision, and obviously there's, then we move on beyond that. Suraj touched on the point about this work being used for CCRA 4, but we're also in discussions with the Met Office about them bringing some of their models into OpenClim. We're talking with the Environment Agency flood modelers, again, having exploratory discussions. And so anybody who's here who has ideas or thoughts on things that they would like to do with OpenClim, using the data, bringing in new models, whatever, please discuss that with us, and we'd love to sort of work with you on that.